when you listen to a lot of this, just a natural reaction. The United States sort of plays a game of teasing countries from everywhere around the world, from George Evans waving money in front of them, it's never quite materializes to Afghanistan, or, well, and I think, and so that PRI may rebound in Mexico. I think because people have been disappointed in is that a lot of promises haven't been fulfilled. There hasn't been a common market and things like that.
Well, I mean, we could go into the U.S. and what the U.S. can do about it, and I'd be happy to discuss it. It seems to me that there really has to be, and it was for a short period of time, both the U.S. and Latin America have to work together. I mean, the U.S. is not going to make policies, whether it's migration policies or integration, trade policies, unless the Latin American countries are prepared to negotiate them and work together and collaborate. And I think that there's no question that the U.S. and Latin America have begun to sort of pull apart from one another. The U.S. is disappointed with Latin America. Latin America is disappointed with the United States. There's a degree of strain in the relationship that's very, very clear. But I don't think either side can solve it by itself. I generally like to think that the best period for U.S.-Latin American relations was what I call Bush 1, that means Bush father, and Clinton 1, meaning the first term of Clinton. And they began to sour sometime during the second term when Clinton could not sort of move forward on the trade agenda in Latin America. And then continuing through Bush 2. So in other words, Clinton 2, Bush 2. But like I say, I think now there are possibilities, but I mean, we had a discussion, for example, a trilateral discussion with Europe, the U.S., and Latin America maybe a couple of months ago. And one of the interesting discussions was, should the United States provide these what they call social compensation, social cohesion funds to help Latin America's development as part of the negotiating trade agreements, which is what the Europeans did, and that's, some people attribute the growth of the improvements in Spain or in Greece to these social cohesion funds. And several people, though, brought out very clearly that the countries of Europe were willing to give up an enormous amount of sovereignty, control over their economic policies, control over their borders, control over the way they managed a number of political, they joined together to negotiate trade agreements together. And Latin American countries aren't quite willing to give up that measure of sovereignty. And I think, though, what I'm getting at is I don't think that the U.S. can just can have a better policy. I can go country by country and say how we could do better with Haiti or Venezuela or here and there. But on the whole, the relationship requires both sides to change from what's very much a destructive relationship now. That's probably exaggerating a little bit, not a constructive one.
Thank you. Be curious to get your thoughts on CAFTA, which seems to be a bit of a stalled issue right now, with the exception of El Salvador, has yet to be ratified by the other countries in Central America. And Bush seems to be spending his political capital on Social Security reform right now, not much mention of trade liberalization. I just want to get your general thoughts on when that might move forward, if that in fact would be the case.
Well, actually, it's good timing for the question. I was in Guatemala last weekend to talk about CAFTA. And, let me say, Guatemala's ratified it as well. And El Salvador, and I think Honduras has ratified it. So at least 3 of the countries have ratified it. The only one that's maybe difficult is the most democratic of the countries, Costa Rica. But even there was a time when the negotiations, the Costa Ricans pulled out of the negotiations for about a week, and then they had a vote in Congress, and immediately they got back in. I think the problem is on the U.S. side, if there's a problem. And the problem has to do with a number of things that, first, I mean, this is actually, we had a discussion of U.S. trade policy at the Inter-American Dialogue where I worked, where we brought together people from the left and right, Democrats, Republicans, to talk about the politics of trade. And it becomes the politics of politics more than the politics of trade. In a sense, there are now about somewhere 15 to 20 Democrats that are going to vote for CAFTA. That they're just, now why so few? According to a Democratic congressman, a former Democratic congressman, that it has to do with the politics of redistricting. That you have 430 congressional districts in the United States. Somewhat like 96% of them belong to one party or the other. That they will always vote Democrat or Republican. So there's no competitive election in 400, I don't know what, 96%, read that quickly, but what that means is the only competition is in the primaries. And what do you have in the primaries? You have very small vote turnout. You have the most vociferous voters voting, so you get more extreme positions on both the Republican and the Democratic side. You get the evangelicals on the Republican side come out very strongly. On the Democratic side, it tends to be unions that tend to dominate, often teachers' unions. And so, and unions are very much against free trade. And the proof of this, or not the proof, but the indication of this is that trade bills almost inevitably pass the Senate rather easily, where you don't have redistricting. For obvious reasons, you don't redistrict states. You have real competition between Republicans and Democrats at the state level, so they tend to moderate their positions. And so, having said all that, and it's a long way to say that if CAFTA is going to be approved, and there's one other, and that creates a situation within the Congress where Republicans don't talk to Democrats. In other words, they don't sit around talking about, gee guys, what can we do to make this more compatible for you? The Republicans sort of form these bills in their own caucuses. Committee members on one side or the other talk to another what kind of bill we want. And so under the circumstances, CAFTA is one of those dividing lines. The Democrats are not going to vote for it. 10% of the Democrats will vote for it, which means you need, about 200 Republicans to vote for it. 195 is quoted as the minimum. A lot of Republicans to vote for it, particularly when you have sugar in the bill, and there are 30 states in the United States that produce sugar. And all those sugar people oppose it because they allow in 1 teaspoon of sugar a week from Nicaragua and 2 teaspoons from the Dominican Republic. Well, they're going to make a deal on that. That's the best guess. In other words, they're going to find a way. What I've heard, one way they're going to do it is, the Dominican Republic has the right to export, like I say, 2 tablespoons of sugar a week to the U.S., but they'll promise not to do it. They'll make an agreement, they're not going to export it. They accept the right, and they're very thankful for that right, but they're not going to. Similarly, the Nicaraguans will agree to that. So they'll find ways that will smooth the way, and in the end, I think that Bush will get his way. That's my guess.
But yeah, it's a microphone coming.
Thank you. You haven't mentioned anything. I'm a little bit concerned about the trade agreements that are being made between China. There was recently one Russian one. I think it was free oil to Venezuela, and the Chinese, of course, are buying a lot of raw materials from Brazil. These are two socialistic, formerly socialistic countries, garnering a lot of attention, giving a lot of economic good to countries which are predisposed towards Latin Americanism. And this worries me, and I'd like to, whether these things will not inflame, more problems down the road. Okay,
I
I'd
have to
like
be asked
comment.
back for another lecture, that's the, because, I mean, the other big news in the region is the leftist governments on one side captures the headline, it's China's entry into Latin America. And this sort of the rumblings of this started about 2 years ago, all of a sudden, not so much Russia, but China. I mean, China's, this huge, it's becoming the major manufacturing center in the world now, because we don't manufacture anymore, we sell services, banking services, and legal services, and universities. The Chinese produce textiles and steel and iron, and in any event, and there's 1.2 billion Chinese, and so the Chinese have sort of come to Latin America in two ways. One was sort of for the countries that produce goods, Mexico that exports to the U.S., the Central American countries that export textiles to the U.S. China was the threat, the looming threat that they have cheap labor, they are better organized, and they can do these things much better. And in fact, they captured, they're capturing huge amounts of the textile market now, and they're beginning to sell cars in Europe. Cars from China are going to be coming to the United States in a couple of years. This is very worrisome to the exporters, and you began to see some of the maquiladoras, which produce so much of Mexico's exports to the United States, seem to be moving to China. That was the analysis. Well, it turns out that the minute the U.S. economy recovered somewhat, all of a sudden we were importing from Mexico. Mexico got a bunch, and Mexico seems to be doing fine. The problem for Mexico, if it has a problem with China, just let me say this, I don't want to go into too much detail. It's not going to be with the low-cost, low-wage China. It's going to be with the high-tech China. In other words, China's producing the engineers and the scientists, and they're importing the technology. They're going to be competing, and Mexico and most other Latin American countries have very poor education systems. They're not producing much technology. So it's not that they should be worried about China coming up from the bottom of the ladder. It's that they're going to be shooting up on top of the ladder. In the southern cone, Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Venezuela, these are all commodity exporters. Brazil is a huge agricultural exporter. I think it may have passed the United States, and if not overall, in some very big commodities. Soybeans certainly exports more to the United States. Argentina is another huge exporter. Chile exports copper and a range of other forest products and walnuts, and Venezuela, of course, exports oil. China buys all those in huge quantities now. But looking at the numbers, and so for the South America, China seemed that's the salvation. They're buying our products in huge amounts, and then the Chinese president comes to Latin America. There's a meeting of the APEC, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, that Chile participates in, Peru and Mexico, and the Chinese president comes, and the U.S. president comes for one day, and goes back and meets with Uribe in an island off the coast of Colombia. The Chinese president visits Brazil for 4 days, Argentina for 3 days, Venezuela, Cuba, etc. I mean, but then you look at the numbers, and you sort of see that, the U.S. is sort of 10, 15 times larger than China if you look at region-wide. China is important for certain countries, certain areas, and may become much more important. But, we can exaggerate that too a bit. And I remember very well the recent history of Latin America. Remember Carlos Salinas, when he was president of Mexico, sort of talked very, he was very proud of the fact that he had his 2 children in a Japanese school, because Japan was going to be the next big thing in Latin America. And then, of course, there was Spain. Spain was investing with Santander, Repsol, and Telefonica, and it outdid the U.S. for several years, and it still, it hasn't stopped. And it talked about the Reconquista even, and we're using, and it's very important, Spain. Spain is playing a crucial role, and it may become more important politically as time goes on. But still, the U.S. is still just a very bigger player, and Spain is not going to sort of displace the U.S. in that sense, at least my saying. Then I remember, there was lots of talk about the South Americans could never understand why there wasn't much nervousness in the United States. They might make a free trade agreement first with Europe rather than with the U.S. Because it's not going to be. Europe doesn't import Latin American agricultural goods. It's not going to give them much of a deal on agriculture. It doesn't give anybody a deal on. Didn't give the Eastern European countries any opening to their agriculture. Why would it do it for Latin America? In other words, yes, the U.S. is in competition on economic ground, but by and large, if the U.S. has a problem with China, it's with China in Asia and China as China, rather than China in Latin America, which is only a small part. China is a big economic power, and what the U.S. has most to fear from China is that it'll stop growing, that it will run into some kind of financial crisis, which, right now China is a huge supplier of money to the U.S. That must be a better word than money, but I can't think of it. In any event, and so the big concern for the U.S. is the health of the Chinese financial system, whether they're going to be able to keep growing and expanding, or they're going to face some kind of bubble, crisis, etc. And so, at least that's my view. 3 or 4 years I may be found wrong. The other thing that's interesting, by the way, China is opposing the changing in the UN Security Council, which would allow sort of Latin America to have a seat. And so there are differences between China and Latin America on lots of issues too.
One last question.
Peter, good timing on that question. It's Jeff Milton. I sometimes still contribute to Latin Advisor. I was going to ask the question about UN reform and where the United States and Latin America, if they have anything in common on this, the idea of Brazil representing Latin America, and yet the other countries say, why do we want a Portuguese-speaking country representing that?
Well, first of all, Brazil insists that it does not want to be Latin American representative. This is very important. Brazil feels it should be a member of the Security Council because it's a big, powerful, important global country. Not that it represents the rest of Latin America, or that, no, it doesn't want to have to consult with Argentina or Mexico or anybody else. It wants to be a member of the council because it's, and I must admit, Brazil has been extraordinarily successful in being now one of this group of 4. The other 3 are obvious next members. Japan, Germany, and India. I mean, I'd be happy to explain it, but it's pretty obvious that these are the big economies, the big population, and Brazil on every criteria. Population, it's big, but it's certainly not India big. It's got a big economy. It's now about the 9th, 10th, 11th largest in the world. But I mean, compared to Germany and Japan, it's a small economy, and it's certainly not much bigger than Mexico and a number of other countries. Korea, for example, Brazil, that the fact that it's managed to get itself into this group is a remarkable success of Brazilian policy, foreign policy, and it's a continuity from, the problem for Brazil is the other Latin American countries are not very happy with this. In fact, Argentina has made very clear, its closest ally in the Mercosur, that it doesn't want Brazil to have that seat. Mexico is clearly not very happy with that. So I think now the U.S. role, I'm sure that John Bolton was named for a reason, and the reason was not to get him out of Washington. I just find it very difficult to imagine that the United States is really, I mean, Bolton's view was, he said that we ought to have a Security Council with one member. And guess who it was? It wasn't China. And the Chinese have argued against it. The Chinese are now the only developing country in the UN. What's actually just as interesting, and again, I don't want to take too long, but is there's an election for the Organization of American States, the regional organization that's actually starts next Monday. It was supposed to start today or tomorrow, but because of the Pope's funeral, it's been delayed till Monday. And this is for somebody watching it, it mirrors the divisions in the hemisphere rather nicely, or rather, sadly, it mirrors it in the sense that you have, on one hand, the South America versus the North America. You have a candidate from Chile who is clearly the choice of most South American countries, although some of Chile's neighbors are unhappy with Chile, so they're not going to vote for the Chilean. And then you have a Central American, Salvadoran, former president, is the U.S.'s, that the only reason he has any chance is the U.S. is out there trying to twist arms to get him. And of course, El Salvador is the only country that has troops in Iraq now, and is probably the most vociferous country on two issues the U.S. thinks is very important, Cuba and Venezuela. So that's clearly a U.S. proxy, the Salvadoran. And then you have a Mexican candidate who represents the anti-South American Latin America. And it's really, and it's a very close race. It's going to be dependent of all things on the, it's one country, one vote in the Organization of American States, and you have 14 Caribbean countries. And you need 18 votes to win. Caribbeans aren't going to all vote together, but it's going to be how they vote that's going to decide this. There's pretty much a tie among the three candidates. And right now in Sousa, probably the South American has the best chance of getting their votes, in part because he treated them seriously and did not try to patronize or bribe or say he was going to do things that they don't think he was going to do.
Well, join me